Welcome to the Feature Focus series. My name is Richard, one of the principal instructors within SOTI's global training team. In this video, we'll provide some examples of how APIs can be leveraged in SOTI Snap. The ability to utilize many different API connections from within SOTI Snap is a very powerful idea to streamline business operations. We'll look at just one or two examples today, and what better system to use in our demonstration than SOTI MobiControl. Many of our viewers will be aware that SOTI MobiControl is a comprehensive solution for enterprise mobility management. And we'll look at some examples of how integrating data from SOTI MobiControl into SOTI Snap brings tremendous value for your business operations. One of our customers uses SOTI MobiControl to manage their shared devices in their warehouses. They need an application where the on-site administrators can view all of the shared device data in one place and allow users to check in and check out devices based on real-time information from SOTI MobiControl. Now, the on-site administrator could see this information from looking at their SOTI MobiControl console on their laptop or their desktop computer. But what if they need to move around the site? What if being static at a laptop screen doesn't work with all the other tasks that they need to do in their day? This is where SOTI Snap comes into play, helping us build a virtual locker application in an app. Now, the on-site administrator has everything that they need from SOTI MobiControl in a mobile app format as they are moving around the site. SOTI Snap offers a user-friendly interface for this app designed for day-to-day interactions such as checking in and out of devices with real-time updates and accurate data. Let's look. So here we can see our virtual locker, and I can select with the variety of devices that we have in the warehouse. I'll choose my device, for example. Now I've got my device selected from the table. If I move down the virtual locker application, I can see further device information. I can see my device name, my device ID from SOTI MobiControl, and information such as whether the agent is online, the current battery level, the model, and other information as well. I can also see if the device is currently in a shared device mode, if it is logged out to a particular individual. And I can currently see that this device is not in use, meaning it is available for somebody to use. And it's not just information that is displayed in the application as well. We can also perform actions from this application. I could trigger a device check-in. I could request a device reboot. I could even log out of a shared device mode if, say, a previous employee has forgotten to log out at the end of their shift. So the question is, where is all this information coming from, and how can we utilize the SOTI MobiControl APIs to make requests to allow this data to be shown in our SOTI Snap application? Let's start with a brief introduction to REST APIs. An API is an application programming interface. It's a common way for two applications to talk to each other. One application would make requests, SOTI Snap for example. SOTI Snap would request information of MobiControl, let's say device information like we can see on screen. Or it could be a request for something to happen, a device action such as a check-in or a device reboot. If there is the appropriate authorization, SOTI MobiControl would grant these requests. A RESTful API is an API that follows the guidelines of the REST architectural style, which stands for Representational State Transfer. RESTful web services are services that operate over the HTTP protocol and uses standard web commands such as get, put, post, delete, and others. And they fulfill standard data functions such as reading, creating, updating, and deleting records within a resource. They support a variety of different data formats, and you can refer to our video on REST APIs to see how you can integrate third-party applications using REST with your SOTI Snap apps as well. But for today, we're focusing on the SOTI MobiControl APIs. A full list of the available APIs can be found in the SOTI MobiControl Swagger page. To get to the SOTI MobiControl Swagger page, I'll go to my browser. I'll remove anything after MobiControl in my URL if I've already accessed or authenticated to SOTI MobiControl, and instead I'll replace it with API. As we see, this loads the SOTI MobiControl Swagger page, which is detailed documentation that talks about using API standards and lists specifications on how to use the APIs. We've got information here such as how to authenticate, the receive our initial authentication token, and once we've successfully done that, information such as common error codes, troubleshooting, and the variety of different APIs that are available. And you can see the variety of different APIs that are available. To successfully call these APIs, we must authenticate to the authorization server and receive an access token to use in subsequent API calls. For the API developers out there, SOTI APIs follow the OAuth 2.0 standard. What does this mean? Well, an analogy for those unfamiliar with APIs, our access token is a little bit like if I was checking into a hotel. If I visit a hotel, before I can go to my room or make use of the gym, I need to be given access. I would therefore go to the check-in desk and present my booking information, my ID, maybe my passport if I'm travelling overseas. And if all of this checks out at the check-in desk, I'm given my key so I can get into my room. And that key would be valid for a specific period of time, maybe 2 days if I'm checked in for 2 days, or 3 days, dependent on my booking information. This access code is very much like the key. It provides access to make further API calls, but I need to check in first. And to do this, we need to provide the authorization server 2 things at minimum. Firstly, we need to possess a SOTI MobiControl administrator's username and password that is either provided directly to MobiControl or configured to an identity provider, such as SOTI Identity. And secondly, have added our application as an API client and possess its client ID and secret. Now, depending on what version of MobiControl you are on, you may need to do some of these features through the SOTI MobiControl administration utility or request this of SOTI support. If you're on SOTI MobiControl 2024 or above, you'll be able to do both those things using the web console if you're logged in as an administrator. Let's do that now. Just before we generate both of these items, please may I draw your attention towards the text that is in red, as it says that the API's calls that are sent from this page are executed against your MobiControl environment. These will make changes to your MobiControl environment. Please exercise extreme caution when executing the API calls against your production environment or device. Of course, the API documentation in the Swagger page is available, so you can familiarize yourself with the detail of what each call is doing. As we mentioned, we require 2 items. Firstly, we have a user name and password, and this could be a local administrative user or a user that is generated through an identity provider, such as SOTI Identity. In our case, I'm going to create a new local user. I'm going to call it Snap API, and I'm going to enter a password as well. Please note we would need to refer to the username, the password, and the client ID and secret that we're about to generate as we are setting up the connection within SOTI Snap. I'm going to assign them the MobiControl administrator role, and I'll click Save. Secondly, we will generate our API client and secret. I'll go to Global Settings, I'll go to our Services, and if you're using MobiControl 2024 or above, there's the ability to create an API client directly within the web console. As mentioned previously, if you are using an earlier version, you will need to either use your MobiControl administration utility to generate the API client, or if you're on cloud, make a request to SOTI support to do this for you. Now, it's good practice to have a separate API client for each app or resource that is requesting API calls from SOTI MobiControl. Also, please note the text in yellow. We need to make sure that we copy our client secret now. It will not reappear after we close our dialog box. Now that we've created both those items, we can actually test that they are working successfully using the Swagger page itself. Please note, with our authentication, we can authenticate both using a resource owner grant type and an authorization code grant type. You can view detail of both within the Swagger page documentation, as you can see. And for the remainder of this video, we're going to focus on the resource owner grant type. To test whether this works successfully, I can go down to where we can actually test the API calls themselves, and you'll see that there's an authorize button. If I select authorize, you'll see that this will ask me for my username and my password, and also my client ID and my client secret, both of which we generated earlier on. So I'll enter this now. Once we click authenticate, we can see that we are essentially logged in, which is the Swagger Page way of saying that we have an authentication token, and we can actually test the APIs and see what is possible before we move on to the SOTI Snap side. So for example, I'm going to go down to, let's say, our devices API calls, and I will just test a particular call which will get the information for the devices that we have within SOTI MobiControl. I can read the information about this API call here, get information in terms of what this API call will do. In this case, it says it returns a list of devices that we have in MobiControl, and we can pass in optional additional parameters as well, such as the device group in a particular format, maybe the device ID as well, additional filters as well. But in our case, I'm just going to try it out as it is without providing any additional filters, execute the command, and we'll see what it provides back to us. So we're provided back both the request URL, so this is the actual API call and the request URL for the API call that we have made, plus a successful code of 200. 200 indicates that we have a successful response, and we can actually see the response body, which is actually providing us information such as the devices that we have in our MobiControl instance. Now there's a lot of information here, so one of the key things when we move over to the SOTI Snap side is actually how we can pull out the relevant values that we require for our application. Maybe I'm not interested in absolutely everything, but I am interested in information such as the device name or the battery level or other key parameters that we can see in this list here. Now that we're in SOTI Snap, we'll use the App Manager section of SOTI Snap to create a new application. I'll choose New Application from the top right hand side, and in this case I'm going to choose to create a new standard app. Please note that there are walkthrough videos within our feature focus series that talk through creating a business application as well. If I click Create Standard Application, I have the choice of a blank application or a form-based app. And in this case, I'm going to choose a blank application because although that there are going to be tables and buttons that we'll place in this application, we're not necessarily sending any information to the SOTI Snap server, which is what a form-based app will do very easily. In our case, we'll actually be displaying information in the table from SOTI MobiControl and sending commands like a check-in to SOTI MobiControl. I'll upload the icon from my application as required, and I'll give my application a name. In our case, we're going to recreate some of those elements that we saw within the Virtual Locker app demonstration as we saw earlier in the video. I'll choose the color and customize any other items that I wish about my application. Click Save and Continue, and then I'll move into the application canvas. Now, when it comes to API calls, there are actually a number of different methods that can be used to utilize APIs within SOTI Snap. We can use APIs within the data connection rules area, where we can see that there's the ability to create a new REST API connection here. And also there's the ability to do this using Blockly code or JavaScript code. In the case of our application, we're going to use Blockly because the table widget that I'm now going to click and drag into our application comes with a number of table properties, including the ability to get data, to sort records, to delete records, and all of these point to a Blockly script which we can edit to put in the information about our access token and subsequent API calls. Let's do that now. So as I click the plus button for getting data, up comes the Blockly script editor. I can start to enter information about my Blockly script. And as the name suggests, the first thing that we need to do is get that access token that we referred to earlier on, which can be used in subsequent APIs to load data into our table. To get the access token, we can use our connection Blockly block. And you can see here that this refers to REST methods such as get, post, put, and delete. And the particular method that we require for our access token is the post method, and we can specify the endpoint for our access token request. which is the fully qualified domain name of our SOTI MobiControl instance, /mobicontrol/API/token. Now, once again, this information can be found from the documentation on the API Swagger page. If I go down to the option of getting our access token, you can see that we have what's known as an authentication header field, which needs to be constructed in a particular way, including the client ID and the client secret. And also for the resource owner grant type, that we have a content body of our API request, which includes a grant type, a username, and the password. How does this get referred to in SOTI Snap? Well, let's see. My authentication header specifies here a username and a password, but rather than the user that we created in MobiControl earlier on, this actually relates to the client ID and the client secret that we created. Let's add this now. You'll notice the password isn't visible in plain text, and actually both the username and the password, once we've saved this blockly code, will no longer be visible. Let's move on to the contents of our request. We can select the data option, and we need to change firstly the format of our transmission, which SOTI MobiControl requires in XWWW form URL encoded format, and then also 3 keys. Once again, these can be obtained from the Swagger page as we saw earlier. The first key will be grant type, with a value of password. The next key will be username, with the name of the username that we created via SOTI MobiControl a little bit earlier. And the last key will be password, with the password of that user that we created earlier on the SOTI MobiControl console. Now we've inputted this information, we can choose the Set Schema option. A schema stands for a blueprint, and this mechanism allows us to test the blueprint, or the way all this data is formatted, to see if the API call will work directly within our blockly code. We select Set Schema, and we can say Get Response from the URL, and we can see if we have a successful response or if we have an error code. In my case, I've got an internal error, an error code of 400. Now, I've actually done this purposefully. I've misspelled my password of my username just to show these error codes that can occur. And once again, you can actually check what the error codes are and what they relate to by looking at the Swagger page. In this case, an error of 400 is indicating that there is a contract validation error or something that has been inputted incorrectly. If I amend the password for my username and test Set Schema again, you can now see that we get a successful URL response, which includes our access token, which we can see here. This is the access token that we'll be using for subsequent API calls. We'll apply this, and once you've clicked apply, we can actually see all of the response data that is available from this API call, including our access token, the token type, the information about the token expiry, and also the refresh token as well. So for example, I've added in battery level and also manufacturer. I'll also sort out the formatting. I'll add a space for device ID, given that these are columns that people will be able to see. And then finally, as said, I'm also going to edit both battery level and manufacturer and make this column not visible. You can use this later on, but it won't be visible within the table for a user. Once we've done all this, I'll click Save, and then we can go back to our blockly code of how to get this data. Our previous post request to get our access token is still there. Once again, I can test this and make sure I'm still getting access token, as I am. And I can also use the table blockly blocks, particularly this one, for loading data into the table to get further information from SOTI MobiControl. From it, I will choose that we're loading data to our device information table. Now that we've named it, it's more clearly identifiable. And next we have a get API request with a URL that we need to insert, which we can add the URL and the API endpoint for our particular MobiControl instance. Again, we can find this information from our Swagger page. So if I go back to the test that we ran directly from the Swagger page earlier, get devices. If I scroll down, I can see the response as we saw earlier, but also the request URL that I can use in a separate application, such as SOTI Snap. I'll copy that, paste into my GET request, now I have the endpoint inserted for getting device information. In addition, I have to pass the access token within this request to demonstrate that I've got the correct authorization. Once again, our Swagger page will be able to give us information about how this can be done. In our Swagger page, we can see that there's information such as how to use an access token. In here we see that we require an authorization header with the key of authorization, followed by the value of the word bearer, followed by the access token that we've received. So within our SOTI Snap load data to table block, that means we've got our URL already included. I'll then go to the headers section, I'll click the plus button, I'll add a key called authorization, and the value of that will be the word bearer, space, and in this initial test, I'll copy and paste the access token that we've already received. Finally, we'll click Set Schema to test whether this works. And our response is the information that we saw from SOTI MobiControl as we ran our test in the Swagger page previously, and we can now use this to apply. And once we click Apply, we'll get the information that we've got from our API response, and we can map that to the appropriate column in our table. For example, the device ID column will be mapped to the device ID that we're getting from SOTI MobiControl. And I'll do the same for device name, battery level, and manufacturer. Excellent. We now have our columns mapped to the information that we're getting from SOTI MobiControl. Now, typing in bearer followed by our authorization token is very helpful for actually doing the initial test and getting our response directly within our Blockly code. However, in the long term, it's not going to be as helpful for us. What we really want to do is pass the information that we're getting directly from the initial post request and giving that information as the value of our authorization. So instead of having the text bearer, we actually just want to get it directly as the initial token has been requested. So how do we do this so we can actually do this on a long-term basis? Well, let me test my URL response once again of my authorization token. I'll click Apply, and when I click Apply, as we saw previously, we can see that we can get the specific, or we can refer to our specific response data, access token, token type, expires, etc. I can also drag this access token reference, this variable for access token, and I can move it to a different place within my Blockly code. What I can then do is replace the manually typed text to reference this variable for the access token. For example, let me add some text, and I'll say I'm looking to pull in a Blockly code that will create text, and I'm going to pass two items in. Firstly, I'm going to add the text with the word bearer, because this is the part that we needed just before we provided the access token, and I'll make sure to include a space after the word bearer. The second part of this will be the actual response data we're getting from our post request. So what this is meaning, it's going to give exactly the same information that we have here, but it's going to pass the live post request into the subsequent API call. Finally, I'll place this where I want for the value of our authorization token, and then finally I'll position our load data in the correct place within our Blockly code. So this is saying once there is a successful access token, the Blockly code will then go on to request the device data. All being well, we can now save this information, make sure we save our app, and we can check if this is working by using the preview. And there we are. We have our device ID, our device name, and we're also getting further information, the battery level, the manufacturer, although we purposely did not make this visible for this table. So that's the first part. We're getting the information from SOTI MobiControl of our devices. Now we can add some further components to our app. For example, additional labels and widgets providing, let's say, the full device name and battery level, and then move on into how we can make action requests from our application. We saw that in our initial demonstration, when a particular row was selected, further areas of the application were updated. So there was an area where the full device name was able to be shown, where the battery level was able to be shown. So how do we tell our application that when a particular row is selected, further information needs to be displayed? Well, before we can actually set the code up to do this, we need to add in some extra widgets. I'll add in some further label widgets. And I'll change the name. My first label widget is going to be called device name. And the second part of that will be blank, with just a space as its default display text. The third widget I will change to battery level. And again, the fourth label widget I will move to blank with only a space as its default display text. In addition to changing the text, I'll also just make sure I can refer to my widgets very easily. With device name label for the device name label, device name value for the currently blank value of device name, and the same for battery level. Now that we've got these all selected, we're going to say that when a particular row, as in a device, which is represented by a row within our table, is selected, the relevant full device name will appear within our currently blank device name value widget, and likewise the battery level for that particular device will appear here. We can do this by selecting our table, and as well as getting the device data into the table, loading the device data in, we've also got the option of events. So we can say on a particular event, when somebody clicks the table or does something with the table, various different actions will occur. In our case, the event that we're interested in is when somebody clicks a particular row. And once again, we can use some Blockly code to describe what will happen. I'll go into my Blockly editor and I'll give it an appropriate name. And I'll start by getting the relevant information from our row from our table. So I can go down to our table blocks, and I'm interested in a particular value from the selected row. So I'm saying the selected row from our device information table, as we named it previously, and the first item here will be the device name. I'll then duplicate, I can just do a right click and duplicate this, and I'll also say I'm looking to get the battery level information from our table as well. Now that I have both of these selected, the question is, where am I sending this data, or what am I going to be using to display this data? So I can use some other blocks, our widget values, to say where I'm looking for this data to be displayed. In our case, I'm looking to set the value of two label widgets to the values that we got selected. So I'll say set our device name value to the relevant column of the selected row. And once again, we can say, set the battery level value to the selected row and the column of battery level for that selected row. Once this is done, let's click Save and see how this looks in preview. Now we have our data loaded to our table as we saw previously. Now if I select a particular row, we can see the name of Android Enterprise 00027, the name of our particular device, and the current battery level, which is at 11%. So we have the foundations of the information we're looking to display, but we need to build this out a little bit more. I wouldn't mind having a percentage sign next to the battery level, and I wouldn't mind formatting these particular widgets in a way that makes them a little bit clearer and allows them to be displayed correctly. So let's do that now. Firstly, to make sure the percentage appears end of the battery level, I will go back to our Blockly code and I'll just use the text block to do as we did previously, to add some more information and allow the percentage symbol to be appended at the end of our battery level. I'll say create text with 2 items. The second item is going to be just a text box with a percentage sign. And the rest of this is going to be, well, what we've already got selected from our particular row. I'll click Save. I'll click Update. And let's just check that this is working correctly. Now of our particular selected device, we now have our percentage sign that is showing correctly. Secondly, I like to format this in a way that stands out a little bit clearer. So I will actually move all of this information into what we call a layout widget. So this allows various different levels of columns or arrangements of our data. And I'll just say I'm looking for this to appear in a single column with potentially a particular color. And I'll drag in device name, the device name value, the battery level, and our battery level value. Finally, I'll do some formatting. I'll reduce the font size, change the alignment, and put the information in bold. Now that's all done, let's see what the overall effect is. Now we have the information we're looking for, we're starting to format that in the way that we want, and we are seeing the device name, battery level, and further information that's been displayed. So this is one example about how we can use some of those columns, battery level for example, that we didn't have visible in our table, but we can refer to them in separate areas of our app. Another function that was available within the virtual locker was the ability to perform a device action through our SOTI Snap app, such as a check-in. Now we can add a button widget to our application with some Blockly code to perform the API for a check-in. But before we do, let's look at the Swagger page and see what's happening with the API call itself. If we go back to the MobiControl API page, we can see that there are a number of API calls underneath the devices section, and of course among many other sections. There's hundreds of APIs that are available. For us in particular, we can use device actions using this post method, where we would actually specifying potentially multiple devices, or this one here, where we're specifying a particular device ID. If I look at the information for this one, an action against a particular device, we can see that there's a number of different supported applications. Allow SOTI surf, clearing restrictions, disabling, and a check-in as well. So we can see that this includes the check-in action, which is what we're going to add to our SOTI Snap application, and we can see what needs to be passed in, as well as the relevant action. We can see check-in here is also the device ID. Where can we get the device ID from? Well, we can get the device ID from SOTI MobiControl, but we've actually just built something that shows us all our devices and IDs. So let's pick one of the devices and the IDs from our SOTI Snap app and then pass it into our Swagger page to see what the results are. Let me select our second device on the list and copy the ID. Copy it in as the device identifier for our API test using our Swagger page, make sure the action is still check-in, and then execute the test API call. We can see that we have a successful 200 response, and as before we can see we have the request URL, and we can see what the format of the URL is, where we have our device, our action of check-in being referenced, and also you can see that the ID is referenced within the request URL. So in terms of how we're going to build this in SOTI Snap, we're going to need to make sure that when we add this with Blockly code, we are somehow referencing the device ID that we're already retrieving within our URL that we're putting in our REST call. Now, just to check that this has worked correctly, let's look at the device details on SOTI MobiControl. If I select the relevant device within SOTI MobiControl, we can see that a device check-in has been requested, which is from our Swagger page test. So we can build in the same functionality within our SOTI Snap application, and of course we could extend that with further actions as well. So to get started, let's build a button that can be used for a check-in when the user selects it. I'll select the button widget and I'll drag that to the relevant place within my application. I'll change the name from button to check-in. And I'll also update the name and ID to refer to check-in as well for easy reference. Next, I'm just going to position the button where I would like it to be placed. For me, I'm quite happy with where it is in the application. I'll just change the alignment of the widget so it is centered. Now, before we start going into any Blockly code specific for this button, so when the user selects this button, we need to keep in mind that for any API call, as we've already seen, we do require our authentication token. Now, I could create Blockly code which requests a new authentication code for each button. However, we've already got that section working. As soon as the table is loaded, we know that we're receiving authentication token. So to save time for ourselves, why not use that already existing authentication token and store it in a way that it can be used in other areas of our app? To do this, I'm just going to make sure that my table auto refreshes, which includes getting a new token every 30 seconds, for example. And in addition, I'm going to go to our data connection rule and I will create a SOTI Snap global variable. Now, a global variable, as you can see on screen, are an easy way to retain and use values across an application. So we can actually write our token to a global variable so we can use it in Blockly code, in other buttons, in other areas of our application, and as we build out the functionality of our virtual locker. I'll create a new global variable and I'll call it token. I have the option for setting a default value or retaining the value even if the application is closed. Now, in our particular use case, I don't really need to make use of these, but if we were using this global variable to say retain someone's name, when regardless of whether they are in or out of the application, these features could be a benefit. For us, I'll click save, and now I can just make a few changes to our already existing Blockly code so we can store our token for use elsewhere in the app. I'll go back to our widget, I'll select the table, I'll go into our get token and device details Blockly code, I'll click edit, and as well as everything else that's going on, I'll also say that I'm going to duplicate our response data block, and I'm going to set the value of our global variable to our access token response data, so it can be used elsewhere. Now that this is saved, let's click our check-in button and then go into the events that are available if our check-in button is pressed. So I'm going to say on click, we're looking to run some Blockly code. I'll go into the Blockly editor and I'll name our Blockly code device check-in for the function that we're requesting from SOTI MobiControl. Once we have this named, we'll go to our connections, I'll pull in a connection, and I'll say we're looking for a post method, and I'll refer to our Swagger page in terms of what we need to supply. We can see our request URL. I can copy the URL, but I do need to make some changes. Rather than referring to a specific device ID here, I'll need to pass in the device ID from the row that we have selected. Now in our request URL, we can see that we're referring to a specific device ID. What we'll need to do, similar to previous code that we've already put in for when a row is selected, we'll just have to adjust our Blockly code that we're dynamically getting with the device ID for whatever row is selected within our table. I'll go down to a connection block. I will choose a REST connection, and we can refer to the Swagger page in terms of the details of that connection, and we can refer to the Swagger page as we've already been testing with in terms of the specific details that need to be passed in. In the case of the action call, this is a post method, and as we did with similar Blockly code, I'll copy and paste the request URL that we need. And we know this is working because we've just tested it directly from the Swagger page. I'll paste this in. However, you may notice that there's a few changes that we need to make because within the request URL, we have our specific device ID that we tested with. So what can we do to avoid this? We can pass in a different device ID. Well, we've actually already seen the REST block that can help with this. We'll go back down to text and we'll choose the option for create text as here. And now I'll say that there's been 3 particular text items we're looking to pass in. The first will be a text string, which will contain the first part of our URL, up until devices. The last part will again be a text string, which contains the last part of the URL. And rather than the static device ID, you may have already worked this out from what we've seen previously, but we can actually refer to what we did with our row click blockly code to refer to the device ID. I'll go down to our table. I'll say the selected row that we've got will refer to the part that we'll put in the middle. Device ID. So we have a fully constructed URL. However, the middle section is just pulling dynamically from the particular device that we have selected. All of this I will move back to the top of our post method and replacing the text URL with what we've created now. Secondly, we know that with any API that we call, we need to include that authorization code. But thankfully, we've got that stored as a global variable. So I can go to our header section, and as we did when we loaded data to the table, I can add a key of authorization and then pull in the authorization code into the value. Remember, we have to have bearer at the start with a space, and then as the authorization code, we can get the value of our global variable, which stores the current authorization token. Finally, we just need to pass one other item of data in, which would be in the body of our request. And again, we can get this information from the Swagger page. Our Swagger page notes that we need to refer to which action we're specifically requesting in our request body. And in this case, we're looking for the action of a check-in. So I can copy this particular format. We can see that this is in the JSON format, and in SOTI Snap, we can refer to this. So now we should have everything we need to perform the check-in function. Just as a note, if I attempt to click set schema here and get the response from the URL, testing the API call within the blockly code, you'll see that I actually receive a message saying that some values or blocks used in our REST configuration are not supported or that can only be known at runtime. Why is this, and why didn't we get this previously? Well, you may see against our selected row block and also against our global variable, there's an exclamation mark. Given that we are getting this information from other areas of the app, other code blocks, other variables that are stored in our application, these can't be obtained as we're testing the blockly code here. What I could do if I wanted to test it is pass in plain text information, which is what I did earlier where I passed bearer and actually the physical value of the token. Now, given that we've done this previously, I'm quite happy to click close and test this in the preview. But just before I do, as a good user experience for the application, it'll be quite good to receive a message if the check-in was successful. And we can use some of our blockly code to do that as well. Underneath our REST call, there's an option that says here on success, meaning that if the REST call is successful, we could get something to appear. We can have another action, for example. One option with this is the ability to have a message. I'll click show, I'll search for show. And I've got the option here of showing a message. So I'll pass this in, show message. And I put in the response saying that the check-in was successful. So this should appear if our check-in to SOTI MobiControl for the device is successful as we test our app. Finally, let's click save. Make sure that our blockly is saved as well. And let's go to preview. As before, the data in our table is loaded. If I select a device, let's say this one, we have our device name, we have the slightly low battery level in the case of this device, and I will click check-in. I get a message that appears saying that check-in is successful. So it appears that our API call has worked, and we can check SOTI MobiControl and the device logs of SOTI MobiControl to see if that was the case. If we go to the relevant device within SOTI MobiControl, go into the logs, we can see that there was a device check-in requested, and it was requested by our SOTI Snap API user, which is the one that we have used within our authentication. So we can continue to use our Blockly code and our knowledge of the APIs to continue building out this application, both the table, the device information that is displayed, actions, and more as we're building out our virtual locker application. In the last few minutes, we've explored how integrating SOTI MobiControl with SOTI Snap revolutionizes your business operations by providing real-time access to device data on the go. If we kept building the application that we've worked through in this video, very quickly we'd achieve all the functionality that we can now see on screen. This integration enhances decision making, streamlines processes, and boosts overall efficiency across logistics, retail, healthcare, and many other industries. Thanks for tuning into this SOTI Snap feature focus. If you found our content valuable, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest updates. To learn more about how the SOTI One platform simplifies mobile-first business operations, visit SOTI.net. Thank you.